I'm Dr. David Adams. Thank you for joining me for this segment as we continue our study of miracle texts and how to read them and how to preach them. We're going to turn in this session to the question of how we go about reading and preaching miracle texts. Remember, our basic question for these sessions was how can we better understand the role of miracles in the Bible and how that we should read them and understand them better and preach them more effectively. We said that our process for this session, these three parts, were going to be first to introduce the problem and give a definition of miracles, which we did in our first segment. Then we were going to look at theological and literary frameworks for reading and preaching miracle texts, and then take up an example. We also said that last time that miracle texts create a certain problem for preachers because we encounter them one at a time in sermons, and they come across to our hearers as independent events unrelated to the larger whole, in which there's something wrong, Jesus comes along and he fixes it. As a result of this isolation, after a while, all miracle texts kind of start to sound the same. And when texts start to sound the same, that's a real problem for preachers because it makes every sermon sort of sound the same. So what do you do to avoid that situation? Well, the answer simply is to slow down. By slow down, I mean read the text more carefully and more thoughtfully by doing two things. First, attend carefully to the literary context in which the account occurs, and then secondly, attend to the theological context. In other words, we want to see the function of the narrative within the context of the broader narrative in which it occurs, and we also want to understand how Jesus is using these miracles in his ministry. I'm going to begin with the second of these first and take up the question of how we attend to the theological context. So, to do this, we need to reflect and study a text with a view to the question, why did Jesus perform this miracle? What does the text tell us that Jesus is doing? What motivated him, so far as we can see in the text? And then, how did this miracle serve the mission of Christ? Now, there's not just one answer to these questions. There's a range of possible answers that have been proposed by other scholars over the years, and I'm going to summarize some of them very briefly for us. The first possible answer here is that miracles serve as evidence that Jesus is the Messiah, that he is the Christ foretold in the Old Testament. Obviously, some miracles focus on that very much. Others, not quite so much. So another common suggestion is that miracles, especially the healing-related miracles, are there to show us the compassion of Christ. Namely, that Jesus performed miracles because he had compassion on those who were suffering. And so they serve as examples of the love of Christ for his creation and for those people whom he created and came to serve. Another answer is provided in an article by Francis Rosso, who argues that miracles are types of the resurrection. That is to say that the miracles of Jesus foreshadow the ultimate miracle of the resurrection, that all the earlier miracles are types or foreshadowing of the ultimate miracle that will come about when Christ rises from the dead on Easter morning. So we should see them all in relation to the resurrection. Another potential answer is offered by Dr. David Schmidt in a lecture that he gave on miracles as prophet Christology. The point here is that the miracles of Jesus show Jesus to be the fulfillment of the promise that God would raise up a prophet like Moses in Deuteronomy 18, but a prophet who was greater than Moses. That Jesus was the fulfillment of the prophetic office of the Old Testament. And Schmidt's treatment of these draws on the preaching primarily of Peter in the book of Acts as an example of apostolic preaching, which draws this tradition and sees Jesus as the greatest, the fulfillment of the prophetic office of the Old Testament. Another more common suggestion is that many of the miracles, at least, serve to highlight the spiritual warfare, that the miracles of Jesus are, in effect, battles against Satan and the kingdom of this world. Yet another possibility is that miracles, some miracles at least, primarily serve to teach us a lesson. They teach a moral lesson or a spiritual lesson to which we should attend. And finally, one last suggestion, and this happens to be one that I personally favor. Miracles announce the arrival of the kingdom of God. Specifically, the miracles of Jesus reveal that the age of fulfillment, which the Old Testament foresees, has arrived in the person of Christ. And they signify that Christ has come to restore the state of Shabbat, or rest, that was lost in the fall. In the Old Testament, this state of Shabbat, or rest, has three primary characteristics. There's the fruitfulness of the earth, or fecundity. There is security, ultimately security in the sense of protection against anything that would threaten God's gift of life, so disease, violence, accident, so forth. And the third thing connected to the state of Shabbat in the Old Testament is the rule of God. This is the covenant language, the victory of God over enemies, and the living of his people under his teaching. So in these 7 things we have listed here, we have a series of possible answers for how we can understand what is happening in a prophetic text. Now, it's not always the case that one of these will be absolutely right and the others absolutely wrong. Quite often, more than one of them can apply, and frankly, a number of them overlap. So sometimes it's a matter of emphasis. But if the preacher attends to these and identifies which one of these he's going to employ, assuming he doesn't employ the same one all the time, that will address the problem of miracle sermons starting to sound all the same. But they also serve another function. They highlight for us the function that the miracle is performing, namely, as we said last time, to demonstrate who God is and to point to what God is doing. So, how does this translate for preachers? What's the solution to the problem? First, what we want to focus on when we read and preach miracle text is to see how the miracle demonstrates who God is, or in some cases, who Jesus is. And secondly, we want to look and focus on how the miracle points to what God is doing, or what Christ is doing in his ministry. So these 7 theological approaches to miracle text can be used both by the reader to understand the text more effectively and by the preacher to preach the text more effectively. So that's a quick look at how we might attend to the theological context of miracles. Let's turn now to the question of how we attend to the literary context of the miracles. We said, remember, that when all miracle texts start to sound alike, we need to slow down and read the text more carefully and thoughtfully, attending to the literary and theological context. So we've already talked about the theological context. I want to focus now on the literary context. How do we analyze a biblical narrative and understand the way that the miracles are functioning within that narrative? The first thing that we have to understand is that miracles are virtually always subplots. Miracles are never in the Bible, hardly. Perhaps the resurrection might be the only counterexample, but miracle texts are not the main thing in the narrative. Miracle texts are secondary scenes or subplots within a larger narrative framework. And so it's important to see what function these miracle texts perform in relation to the whole. One way to do this is to simply adopt a very simple, straightforward set of 3 questions to ask yourself. 1, what is the conflict that's happening in the narrative, and how does the miracle relate to it? Secondly, how is this conflict resolved? What is the climax to which the miracle points? And then finally, the resolution. How is this miracle interpreted by Jesus and by his audience? Another way to think of these is in terms of problem and solution and demonstration or proof. Let's just drill a little deeper into each of these. First, let's begin with the problem. We need to approach this, a miracle text that is, and ask ourselves, what is the nature of the problem that's being addressed? Secondly, how is the intercession, how is that described? And thirdly, what role does the context play? And the context could either be the actual historical context and events or the literary context. What function does the context play in helping us to understand what's going on here? So I want to walk through each of these. That's the problem. Let's turn now to how the solution should be approached. The solution can be approached in terms of the means by which the problem is resolved. That is to say, how does Jesus do what he does? And secondly, what is the manner by which the problem is resolved? What is the attitude that Jesus depicts? What's the attitude of those around him who perceive what he's doing? And then the third part, we said, was the resolution or the proof. What confirmation is there of the miracles? How do others respond to what Jesus did? And how does Jesus himself interpret his actions? If we approach all 3 of these things and analyze them carefully, we'll be able to see what is distinctive and unique about each miracle. And getting at that distinctive, unique aspect of the miracle, both in literary terms and in theological terms, is really how we avoid having miracle sermons just all sound the same. Thank you very much. I'm Dr. David Adams. I appreciate you joining me for this segment. And in our next segment, we're going to turn to an example and see how we might implement this in one of the miracle texts of the New Testament.